Mr. President, have the honor of representing Louisiana in the United States Senate. And it gives me no pleasure to say that in Louisiana we have a crime problem. In Louisiana, and frankly in other parts of America, I regret to say, criminals are turning neighborhoods into war zones and small towns into drug dens. And in the process, families are being destroyed. Now, some people make a youthful mistake, and they could benefit from a second chance. I think most Americans agree with that. But other people never change. I don't know why it is. If I make it to heaven, I'm going to ask. But there's some people out there, they're not mixed up, they're not confused, they're not sick. It's not a question of whether their mama or daddy loved them enough. They're just bad. Unfortunately, they're just bad. And for that reason, I think we all recognize that prisons are a necessary fixture that make our communities safer. As we prepare, Mr. President, to hear a bill or bills on changes to sentences for federal prisoners, I wanted to share with the Senate a cautionary tale from my home state of Louisiana. People in my state are being killed, and people in my state are being hurt because of these so-called criminal justice reforms, I put that expression in quotation, that were put in place by my governor. Louisiana, about 14 months ago, started letting prisoners out of our prisons. The overall goal of the governor was to save money. So far, I think he's let out about 2,000 prisoners. Now, the inmates that he let out were not vetted. They weren't vetted by the probation boards. They weren't vetted by the parole boards to see if they were a threat to public safety. These prisoners that he let go weren't paired with programs to reduce recidivism. He just let them go. He did it under a statute that he named and called the Justice Reinvestment Act. There certainly wasn't any reinvestment in justice for the victims. His law is failing the law-abiding public in my state. So far, 22% of the inmates have been rearrested. Now, that's over 14 months, a very short period of time. The governor and his Department of Corrections said, well, we're only going to release nonviolent criminals. Well, somebody forgot to tell the criminals that they were nonviolent. In the 23rd Judicial District Court in Louisiana, which encompasses small towns and 3 parishes, 1 in 3 inmates that Louisiana state government let go have been rearrested. That's higher than the 22% I just quoted. That's a recidivism rate of 33% in a little over a year. I've talked to Louisiana's law enforcement officers and prosecutors. They don't support what the Edwards administration has done. Now, they're scared to say anything because the governor controls a lot of their budgets and their money. But if you ask 9 out of 10 law enforcement officials in my state privately if they support it, they'll tell you no, and the 10th is probably lying. The head of the District Attorneys Association, in fact, has publicly said that Louisiana streets are not safer because of this so-called criminal justice reform. He also noted that simply reducing prison population is not a measure of success. He's a wise man. Louisiana state government now seems to care more about criminals than it cares about those criminals' victims. In fact, I've never heard my governor talk about victims at all. It's always criminals. Mr. President, I recently received a letter. We all get letters from constituents, but this one really shook me up. I received a letter from a constituent in South Louisiana about what this failed experiment of criminal release in Louisiana has cost his family. And his words, this gentleman's words, have been weighing on my heart and on my mind since I read them. And I'd like to read a bit from that letter now. I'm quoting. My name is Gary Prince, and my youngest son, Jordan, was killed by a drunk driver in May of 2015. He was only 18 years old and had just graduated high school 12 days before this accident. The man that killed him was driving the wrong way on Highway 90 near New Iberia and crashed into my son head on. His blood alcohol level was 0.16, which is twice the state's legal limit. He was sent to jail with a sentence of 15 years. But this person that killed my son served only 18 months in jail. Mr. Prince, the father, goes on, quote, there's a state law which states that anyone convicted of a DUI with vehicular homicide with a blood alcohol level of 0.15 or greater has to serve a minimum of 5 years without the benefit of early release. This was not taken into account for this criminal. My son was a good kid. He had a bright future. He wanted to follow in my footsteps and become a machinist. I feel that my family deserves better than this. I want you to know that when I say my prayers at night, I pray for a better Louisiana. End quote. Mr. Prince, I want you to know how sorry I am for you and your family's loss. While the state of Louisiana might consider this a nonviolent crime, your family paid a horrific price for this man's behavior. I can't imagine anything worse than a man or a woman having to bury his or her son, especially a teenager. For your son's killer to be out on the streets after 18 months is more than just salt in the wound. It's a miscarriage of justice. And it's precisely what happens when policies like criminal release programs are pursued without considering the victims or their families. It's not justice, Mr. President. I believe in justice. I think most Americans do. What is justice? We talk about it a lot. I agree with what C.S. Lewis said. Justice is when somebody gets what they deserve. I'm not saying that deterrence and rehabilitation are not important in a prison system. They are. But they have nothing to do with justice. They have to do with the effectiveness of your prison system. C.S. Lewis said, justice is when people get what they deserve. Justice is when the people of Tibet, for example, get to worship the Dalai Lama because they deserve religious freedom. Justice is when a rapist is sent to prison and stays there for a time commensurate with his crime. That's justice. He's getting what he deserves. And C.S. Lewis didn't just say that. Immanuel Kant said that. He said our penal laws are a moral imperative. He didn't say rehabilitation is unimportant. He didn't say deterrence is unimportant, because they're both important. They just have nothing to do with justice. And Hegel said the same thing, And St. Augustine said the same thing, and all of the great thinkers in history. Justice is when you get what you deserve. It doesn't have anything to do with the cost of government. It doesn't have anything to do with deterrence. It doesn't have anything to do with rehabilitation. Those are all important factors, but they have nothing to do with justice. A criminal release program gone wrong has had other effects in Louisiana too. It frees people like Tyrone Smokey White. Let me tell you about Mr. White. Our governor let him go. He's a career criminal. He repaid the state promptly by robbing 2 roofers at gunpoint. Somebody forgot to tell Smokey that he was supposed to be nonviolent too. Less than a week later, Mr. White was released under Louisiana's criminal release program despite having more than 60 arrests on his record. 60 arrests. A criminal release program gone wrong looks like a convicted felon named Richard McClendon, who upon being granted early release illegally gets himself a gun, uses it to fatally shoot another man in Bossier Parish. He then leaves his victim to die, like a roadkill, on the side of the road with multiple gunshot wounds. A criminal release program, in Louisiana anyway, gone wrong looks like a Dwayne Watkins. He's a pedophile. He had more than 21 arrests for child abuse and other assorted crimes on his record. He got to walk out of jail early. Not just once, but 2 times. Watkins earned 10 years for illegally possessing a gun as a felon, and he got out early, and he promptly sexually abused 2 young girls. He earned 3 more years in jail, and then, thanks to Louisiana state government and the Edwards administration, he got out early again. Give me a break. In October, less than 2 months after his early release, he approached Kelly and Heather Jose at a shopping mall in Caddo Parish. When he asked to borrow their phone to call a cab, the couple offered him a ride. Louisiana, we help each other. Well, Mr. Dwayne Watkins decided to repay their generosity by kidnapping them, shooting them, burning them to death in their own car so badly that their bodies couldn't even be recognized. He's now awaiting trial for murder. Kelly Jose, one of the victims, was an Air Force reservist. God rest her soul, at Barksdale Air Force Base. She enlisted in the Air Force in 1998. Heather Jose, the other victim, was a small business owner. She loved working in the ministry of her church. They were good people. They were just trying to do a good deed. This was a senseless tragedy, and it did not have to happen. And just this weekend, Mr. President, our sheriff from Caddo Parish rightly asked a question. He said, why is Dwayne Watkins out of prison after violating his parole and sexually abusing 2 young girls? And many of us are asking that same question in Louisiana right now. But the answer is very simple. The Edwards administration's failed criminal release program. Mr. President, I want to take a moment and consider what price we might be asking the families back home to pay for these criminal release programs. In my state, innocent people are scared, and rightfully so, that they might become victims of violent crime. We're reneging, Mr. President, on the justice we promised to victims like Mr. Prince who lost a child. You want to put a price tag on justice? Have at it. I don't. We also failed in Louisiana the Jose's 3 children. They don't have parents anymore. Mr. Dwayne Watkins took care of that. He should have been in jail serving his time. That's justice. Louisiana's failed experience has cost law-abiding folks dearly, Mr. President, in every corner of my state. And I just want to implore my colleagues in the Senate, to please think about more than just the criminals. Think about more than just the money. Think about the lives of the victims and their families as well, because they're supposed to count too.